Hello again and welcome back to Sustainability Live Singapore. Time for our next fireside chat, and that is navigating Scope 3 emissions. Those are insights from Schneider Electric. My guest is Jin Park, Chief of Staff to EVP Energy Management at Schneider Electric. Thanks so much for joining us, Jin. How are you?
Hello, thank you so much for having me. Doing great.
Excellent, excellent. Right, Scope 3 emissions, they are a huge part of sustainability, a huge talking point, and where we will start on this conversation. And it might sound like an obvious question, but do you think we can really take for granted that everyone, all our partners, procurement partners, anyone else we collaborate with, really understand Scope 3 emissions and how they can go about reporting and measuring them?
Absolutely. Indeed, when we talk about Scope 3, I think it still remains one of the most challenging. It is definitely the biggest emissions in terms of impact, but also the most challenging to understand. So I'll take maybe a few minutes just to unpack a little bit the different dimensions of it. But first, I think it's important to acknowledge that across most of the companies, including Schneider Electric, the Scope 3 emissions represent 80% or more of our emissions. For Schneider, it's more than 90%. And what that means is, we can also become the most energy efficient company, use the most, amount of renewables in our own footprint. But at the end of the day, it's about engaging our ecosystem, engaging our suppliers, engaging in our own R&D practices to really make an impact on net zero and to reduce our emissions. So when we look at Scope 3, actually there are two parts to it, right? There's what we call the upstream, which is all about our supplier engagement, so the companies that we are buying from. And here, the practice is really around how do we engage the small, mid-sized companies to empower them, enable them on their own decarbonization journey. And then there's a second part to it, which is the downstream. And this is actually all about how do we as a company, build and implement more products and services that help to lower emissions for our customers.
I guess the obvious question is how you actually impact those maybe smaller or medium-sized organisations that don't have the same infrastructure to be able to control their emissions. What advice would you have there about actually going out there and making a real impact with those sort of organisations?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And, at Schneider, for example, we partner with both large companies, helping them develop their own supplier programs. And we also have our own supplier program where we're engaging directly with our top 1,000 suppliers. And I think there's one part is, as I mentioned before, it's about enabling. And that comes in the form of a lot of education and resources. These small, mid-sized companies, they don't have access to the same expertise in-house or even know where to go to. One of the first questions that a supplier will ask is, I'm on board, I'm committed to making an action, but where do I start, right? How do I even measure my footprint? And you mentioned it already, right, that most of the solutions out there today, most of the best practices are centered around the large enterprise customers, right? So even software programs that are out today to help companies measure and track emissions are quite complex, quite large, and they're fit for large enterprise, often at a higher price point, but maybe they're not right sized for the SME players. So it starts with, I think, helping them gain access to the right digital tools, helping them build a community of experts that they can engage to understand what are the opportunities and what are the resources available, technology or expertise. And then lastly, it's really about helping them to build a community and more importantly, helping them engage locally. I think we take for granted, when we are a large enterprise company that we have access to expertise in all different parts of the world. But regional players, really look at their emissions footprint from regulation to technology to the expertise they can engage. It all comes from their local markets. So one of the things that we've practiced at Schneider Electric with our own suppliers is actually setting up a regional workshop. So beyond the digital online tools and education that we can provide, it's really connecting them with an ecosystem of their own peers that they can learn from, and also the experts in their own local markets who can help them understand the different dynamics of technology and regulation.
Because every major company will have a code of conduct, a supplier charter, call it what you like, there'll be something along those lines, or as you say, these sort of workshops. It's great these things existing. How do you make sure that the SMEs actually engage with them and actually reach tangible benefits from engaging with them?
You know, I think the first step, of course, is to help them measure their footprint, right, and understand where are the opportunities. And then I think the next part is helping them connect them to tangible outcomes. And often, you know, just saying we're here to decarbonize and your goal is to reduce emissions is not enough. We need to help them build a business case and help them prioritize the right investments in the right sequence. So I think that's a really important part of bringing the right resources to the table for the SMEs, not only to understand, you know, what is the overall plan in terms of how do they get from point A to point B, but also what are the digital tools that they need to deploy in order to track and measure their success. And then, of course, you know, how does it fit into their business? Because at the end of the day, you know, I think sustainability can't be taken as a once and done. Right? It needs to be a core part of the DNA. And for that to happen, it really needs to make business sense for them. So the easiest lever and the most immediate impact is, of course, reducing energy efficiency. Improving energy efficiency. So when we look at the fastest path to net zero, we say that, you know, much of the companies today are focused on the supply side, but actually about 55% of the impact that you can have towards net zero comes from the demand side. And those are actually the most immediate impact in terms of emissions, but also ROI, as companies are starting to invest in more energy efficient technologies or digital tools that help them automate and monitor and continuously improve their efficiency. They're also gaining ROI and savings that they can then deploy into other maybe more CapEx projects. So it's these kinds of, I think, strategies and tools that you can provide to SMEs to not only help them, you know, take the next step forward in terms of turning it into action, but helping them see how this can also help to improve their business in terms of bottom line impact.
Yeah, Jen, I think you absolutely hit the nail on the head there about it not being one and done, because a supplier could have introduced, I don't know, solar panels or new technology or a new tech solution and think, excellent, we've ticked that box, we are now a sustainable company because we have done X. For you, how vital is it that continuous improvement is championed with suppliers to make sure they don't consider it to be one and done?
It's really important because actually the most exciting thing I think around Scope 3 and probably what differentiates it from Scope 1 and 2 is that when you're looking at Scope 1 and 2, it's all about how do you impact your own operations, right? Whether it's reducing energy consumption or deploying more renewables. But Scope 3 is looking at the ecosystem, at your end-to-end value chain. And here the conversation is much larger, right? It's about influencing beyond your own parameter. And it goes everything from, you know, what do we do to help deploy the right technologies to our suppliers, to also looking at our own solutions to say, how do we reduce the emissions footprint of our own products and services so that we're deploying more circularity practices so that when a customer is using our solution, it reduces less emissions across their operations and also across the life cycle of that product. And so when you look at it in that context, right, it's really a continuous, I say, thought process, right? It's more than just what do we do today to reduce the emissions impact by 2030, but it's about how do we transform our business practices, everything from who we buy to the R&D design stage, and really making it, I think, a core part of our DNA. Because I think we can all agree at this stage, and you know, you see so many more companies committed to net zero, committed to science-based targets, and that's because we are all in agreement that the way that we're operating today, in terms of who we buy, how we operate, the energy that we use, is not sustainable. So really, this is about resiliency, about building business resiliency, and that's not one company's job, right? It's not one thing that we can do. It requires engaging the whole ecosystem.
Now, Jim, one question I often hear is, about how difficult Scope 3 emissions can be to tackle because of the lack of visibility. That's consistently the challenge. What advice would you have for people in improving their visibility? Because when you have that visibility, you can fix the problems. You can't fix what you don't know isn't there. So what would your advice be on visibility?
Absolutely. Actually, thanks to IoT, right, we've been on this journey of being connected, getting more devices connected, and it's been on a journey for, I would say over close to a decade now, decade plus. And when you look at the amount of energy data a company has, it's quite substantial. Most of the devices today are already connected, but what companies lack, from enterprise to SMEs, is actually probably the right platform to consolidate that data and to do really some analysis on it, right? You're still using spreadsheets in some cases. So I think one of the best steps that a company can take on their decarbonization journey, as you said, is to make sure that not only are they measuring, but that they have the right view and the right platform to help them leverage that data, extract value from that data, and so that they can inform their plan.
Well, let's move on to some of our audience questions, as there are plenty coming in. Thank you so much for sending these in. I'll start with Bitasta Roy Beto, who sent one in, and that's talking about the categories of digital tools you'd recommend for MSMEs, because I'm sure there's plenty of smaller organisations who are wanting to improve their performance but aren't really sure how. What kind of advice would you give them?
I think in terms of the tool, there are probably a huge ecosystem out there in terms of tools that can be deployed. When you look at when you're looking for digital tools to deploy, I think one is, of course, compatibility in terms of what you're looking to measure and making sure that platform has the right infrastructure to support it. So that could be anything from your water, your energy, to your lighting. And I think the other aspect is also to think about how you're going to use that data, whether it's going to be for monitoring and maybe establishing scorecards or to reporting, because often these tools, they might give you a better view of your data, but you also want to make sure that it's well connected to the different platforms you're looking to employ.
Another question here, unfortunately this one's anonymous. Do say who you are and where you're getting in touch from. That is always appreciated. How easy is it to reduce Scope 3 emissions, given that a lot of organisations focus on Scope 1 and 2, because it's potentially easier to make an immediate impression on? How important is it and how easy is it to reduce Scope 3 when the focus may be elsewhere sometimes?
Yeah. No, I think, Schneider's been on this journey ourselves, right? We have committed to engage our top 1,000 suppliers to reduce our Scope 3 emissions 50% by 2025. 2025 is tomorrow. And I can say that, in the beginning of the journey, it takes some time to on-ramp and onboard suppliers, because it's a lot about not only educating them in terms of what is Scope 1, 2, and 3, but also helping them, again, access the resources that they need. And then as you go through your journey, you start to realize where your suppliers really need support and in terms of what can really move the needle for them. So I would say it definitely requires some time to gain momentum. But here, speaking with you today, we've made some tremendous progress in terms of our Scope 3 emissions, but I think it's a continuous journey. The other thing that is important, I think, for large companies such as Schneider to take into consideration when they're deploying their supplier programs is also having the right governance in place. As I mentioned, as a large global enterprise, you have suppliers in different markets. It's very decentralized. And part of what makes any global program work, any change management program work, is about making sure that you have the right experts and also SPOCs within your organization that's going to keep the momentum going. So it's definitely not an easy task, right? It's going to take time. But I think the best news is that the resources and the technologies are already out there. And it's about really continuously engaging your suppliers and motivating them and enabling them through resources to make it happen.
The questions are coming in thick and fast for you, Jen, so I'm going to try and get through as many as I possibly can. Next one from Chris. How is Schneider promoting circularity for Scope 3?
So, circularity is something that we've been practicing for a few years already. For us, it's really about embedding it into our DNA. So we start, of course, with circularity in terms of what can we do within our own operations, our own R&D, to extend the life cycle of our products. We also have, of course, services to help our customers do the same, whether it's modernization practice or take back practice. But I think the next evolution, right, in addition to the services and processes, that's let's say a transitory step to ultimately making it part of our DNA, meaning that, when you look at an R&D process or you look at a manufacturing process, just as important as quality is and cost is for our development process, it's making sure that emissions impact is concretely part of that, meaning certain projects get prioritized over others because they have a better emissions footprint. That's really the future next step of circularity for us.
Next question, because they are, as I said, coming in thick and fast. Did Schneider face any difficulties in defining its boundaries for Scope 3 emissions earlier on in your sustainability journey?
I think for sure, when you think about where you set your boundaries and your parameters, it really is a discussion in terms of how you prioritize and focus your efforts. So for sure, there was, before we even launched the top supplier program, before we even engaged with our suppliers, it was really about identifying and defining for ourselves what is the framework and what is the approach that we want to take. So in terms of difficulty, I think it's more about aligning at the highest level of your organization and being very clear in terms of this is the area of focus and the parameters that we want to set for ourselves. But it's really more of a conversation, a very important step for sure before deploying.
A key question when it comes to Scope 3 is about collaboration, though, because it's a collaboration with the partners, it's a collaboration with the ecosystem, but I guess there's a degree of collaboration between other major companies when it comes to standardization and similar goals. How vital are those partnerships in both directions to try and bring Scope 3 emissions down for everybody?
Yeah, no, it's a great question because, one of the other challenges, probably the biggest challenges, is that there is no standard, benchmark today, right, for Scope 3. But when and similarly, there's no standardized tools or platforms for Scope 3 emissions. One concrete example I can give you and definitely reinforces, I think, the importance of companies, large companies, let's call them sponsor companies, to come together is around renewables. As you know, when you're accessing a renewable market and you're making a bid for power purchasing agreements, as an example, there are certain thresholds that these developers need you to hit in order for you to apply or qualify for a PPA. And often these SMEs don't qualify for that. And with Scope 2 being probably the easiest lever, as we can say sometimes, to reduce your emissions, there's a real barrier for SMEs to make any advancements on that because they often don't have the energy load or demand that qualifies them to participate in the renewables market. And so one of the things that we have been doing at Schneider Electric together with industry partners is working with sponsor companies to create cohorts. So one concrete example I can give you, and we've done this across, semicon and in pharma, but most recently in semicon, we launched the Catalyze program, which really brings together the sponsor companies, major players and customers in the semicon industry, where we're coming together to develop a cohort, which brings more awareness to SMEs within that industry. The suppliers of these sponsor programs bring more awareness in terms of what are the renewable energy opportunities, what are the contracting terms, the financial framework that goes behind it, and ultimately bring a cohort that they can participate in order to access renewables. So that's one of the key ways that I think the large enterprise can collaborate and come together in order to bring more access and enable the supply chain to decarbonize.
Just going back to the audience again, as the questions keep on coming for you today, Jin. So this one is from Sam, and it's asking about what Schneider's top Scope 3 emission sources are. And I'll just add to that, because I'm sure you know what they are. What strategies are you following to bring those down?
Yeah, I've spoken about much of the strategies already, but when you look at our emissions, actually our Scope 3 emissions, over 90% come from Scope 3. And that's really actually, I think, an outcome of the decade plus of work that we've done to reduce our Scope 1 and 2. So really now we're zoning in on our Scope 3. And within our Scope 3, about 15% comes from our upstream. So this is from our suppliers. And the rest really comes from our downstream. Downstream, as I mentioned, this is all around, how do we help our customers save and avoid emissions? This can be everything from circularity practices within our R&D to bring more green materials, to use less materials, and also improving the energy efficiency of our equipment to make sure that when they're operating, they're contributing to less emissions. And of course, the take back and circularity services that we have, which is about once a product is deployed in terms of modernization, in terms of take back, how do we use and reuse and repurpose our systems and equipment and make it easier for our customers to do so. And that is all connected to the downstream Scope 3 emissions, which makes up a big part of our Scope 3.
And a final question for you, Jin. It's a theme that has recurred quite a few times through the presentations today about it's one thing making sure a business is compliant. Of course, they have to be compliant. How important is it for you that companies such as Schneider and others go above what is compliance and aim higher if they possibly can?
And I think this is a perfect question for Scope 3, right? Because as I mentioned at the beginning, it's really the next frontier of decarbonization, because you're not just looking at what can you as a company do, but what can you as an industry or as a region do. And I think this is all about building more resiliency as an industry, as maybe a region, in terms of business resiliency, in terms of how do we continue to serve our customers, grow exponentially, invent new innovations to serve our customers, but in an ecosystem that is sustainable, meaning that even down to I talked about materials before and circularity. Certain materials like copper, there's a limited source, right? So how do we make sure that as we're building the next growth engine of our company, of our industry, that we're making sure that sustainable practices are in place so that we're still profitable and we're still growing in the next 10, 25, 50, 100 years.
Okay, Jin, that's a wonderful place for us to finish. We've been absolutely flooded with questions for you. I've got through as many as I possibly could. And thanks so much for your time. You've been very generous with your thoughts and opinions today. Thank you so much for joining us at Sustainability Live Singapore.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're very welcome. Thank you.